Well, hey everybody, my name is Ted Metz, and I was born in Columbus, Ohio, and pretty much raised in Virginia Beach, Virginia. I went to Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, and then graduate school at the University of South Carolina in Columbia, South Carolina. I was a sculpture major in college and always wanted that ideal position of teaching at a university. And as I moved from Ohio to Virginia to South Carolina, I really liked the South. And so when it was time for me to try to apply for college teaching jobs, I applied to every school south of Virginia from coast to coast. And there were 3 openings that year. And the University of Montevallo, which I'd never heard of before, was one of them. And I was very fortunate at that time to have gotten this job. And that was in 1973 I came here. I was 24 years old, and been here for 42 years teaching and retired in 2016. I still live in Montevallo. I have my studio at my home, and I continue to produce sculpture. Well, you know, when I was growing up, I have no recollection of aspiring to be anything particular. I mean, I really was kind of lost in high school. I had never known an artist, and I just didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And I was concerned in high school because I wasn't sure if college was my next best move after high school. So I went to my high school guidance counselor, and which is pretty rare for a high school kid. And she basically said, "Oh, don't worry about it, Ted, just go to college and you'll figure it out." Well, this was in the height of the Vietnam War, and so going to college was seemed to be a good thing for the college deferment and all that. But after 2 years of college, I still wasn't there. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I got very close to enlisting in the armed services just so I could have more time to mature and figure out what it is I wanted to do with my life. But before I did that, I went to the college guidance counselors, and I sat in their offices and took a battery of tests for a couple of days. And they found out that I was interested in engineering and drafting and art and sociology and music and forestry. I guess everyone gets forestry, so you can plant a tree if nothing else works out for you. So after getting the results of the college assessments, I decided to take a course in every area that my testings showed that I have some interest in. And I was in the art department for 2 weeks, and I knew that's where I needed to be. I had never experienced art before. I mean, I took it in high school, and I drew when I was a kid, and I built models and made forts, and I liked to build things, but I never knew that art was a possibility as a career. I grew up in a family, a very nice, loving family, but we were not art aficionados in any way. I'd never been to a museum until I was in college. But when I went into the art department at Old Dominion University, it was magic. I'd never been in a situation where students worked past the end of the class, or students were there in the evenings, or students were there on the weekends. And I didn't know if I had any talent or not, but I knew that's where I felt the most comfortable. And so it turns out I did have a little bit of talent, and went on and finished a BFA in sculpture at Old Dominion, and then went directly from Norfolk, Virginia to Columbia, South Carolina, where I got a master's degree in sculpture, and also was able at the University of South Carolina to teach, which was an amazing situation because I found out I really liked teaching. Now back then, I don't know how much I knew, but I knew I liked interacting with students, which were basically the same age as me at that time. So like I said, I started searching for jobs, and interestingly, when I was looking for jobs, I told all of my colleagues and all of my friends, I said, I will go anywhere but Alabama or Mississippi. And you know, you say something like that and it will seal your fate. So you need to be careful about saying declarative things, what you will and won't do. But actually, you know, this is in the early 70s, and the racial tensions in the South were terrible, and there was a lot of negativity coming, you know, surrounding race, and I just didn't want anything to do with that, really. But I got here, and I found that I found that it was a very pleasant and wonderful environment to work in, and move forward from there. I was enamored with the campus that was like a New England kind of liberal arts school, and I found, as you well know, that it's designed by the Olmsted brothers, who designed Central Park and many Ivy League schools. So the environment here was great. The racism that I worried about was at least covert. I mean, it wasn't in your face, and it was a good environment, good place to be. And so I figured I'd stay here a few years, and that was, almost 50 years ago. So I'm still here. In terms of my personal art, I kind of was educated in abstract expressionism and non-objective work. And in the late 60s and early 70s, there was absolutely no, at least where I was going to school, there was no interest in the figure as a subject matter for sculpture or even painting or drawing or printmaking. I mean, certainly people did it, but it wasn't the focus. It was kind of the new non-objective and abstract expressionistic genres that were taught and appreciated most back then. So my work over the years has really transformed a lot, from installations to polished stainless steel to work in ceramics. By the way, when I got the job here, I was trained as a sculptor, but I had like 1 or 2 courses in ceramics in my graduate experience. And the job here called for a ceramics and a sculpture professor. So I gladly embraced that and learned a whole lot about ceramics on the job. So basically in the early part of my career here, I was doing both ceramics and sculpture. And it was wonderful to learn on the job about the materials and processes that I was not as familiar with as I could have been. So I learned on the job with that. But anyway, my work, one of the nicest things about the art department here, and I think I might have helped foster this early on, was that we were real interested in having an art department that was, where the faculty were artists. They were artists first and faculty members or teachers second. And with that idea in mind, we were very careful with the kinds of people that we hired to make sure we got a broad cross-section of the art that was being produced. And so we were looking for that kind of quality in artistic expression. And then the fact that they could teach was also a bonus, of course, but the artists, we figured in the fine arts you need to have mentors. You need to have people who are out there doing what they're teaching. And so we were very careful in all our hires to hire artists who happen to be good teachers as well. So my work as practicing artists and within the university system, we're encouraged to be professional outside of the teaching arena. And so, we're evaluated on teaching, research, and service. And so for art department faculty and College of Fine Arts faculty in general, that means performing or giving recitals or exhibiting your work. And so as an exhibiting artist, I had lots of experience and lots of shows in Italy, and showed in the National Gallery at one point in Washington, D.C., that kind of thing. And so the work was generally on a small scale, but I'd always wanted to do large public work. And the work that an artist produces in their studio is one thing, but given the opportunity to work on a public piece, which is in a very specific location and for a specific community, is a greater challenge, really. And so I got my first opportunity to make a large sculpture in Hoover, Alabama, and it's very different from the Becoming sculpture. It's an architectural abstraction, and it has to do with the up-and-coming and dynamic community that Hoover was and still is. And that led to some other pieces, public pieces that were at UAB, for instance, and Health South in Birmingham. I now have a piece in Aldridge Gardens in Hoover, Alabama as well. And my most recent sculpture is a piece in Columbiana, Alabama, which is in front of the Old Mill Square Center for the Arts there, which was just installed a couple of months ago. And so I really enjoy working on a big scale. I enjoy working beyond my physical capacity. I mean, when you do big work, it requires structural engineers to determine how much concrete you need to put underneath the sculpture to hold it up, and all kinds of safety measures for the public. And I think that public art, good public art, is always designed specifically for the environment in which it's placed and for the community who's going to encounter it. A lot of times, public art becomes an afterthought to a building construction project and becomes kind of like a decoration for a building or icing on the cake. But the best public art is when the artists and the engineers and the artists and architects, planners and designers are kind of working together on a common goal, and projects kind of evolve that way. So I'm really enjoying the site-specific kind of work. Now, becoming was a challenge for me in many ways. We celebrated our 100th birthday in 1996. And as a part of that celebration, this Bowers Colonnade was developed. And I thought the architects who did this particular site were really inspired. They gave us a brick archway with a classic bell and a limestone that's all over campus. And the structure of it, and the materials of it, kind of fit beautifully, I think, within the campus. But they also gave us some kind of a more contemporary edge to it. And for instance, these four staggered columns that move toward the arch, they are representative of the four classes, the freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior classes. And I looked at this as this gate, this archway, as kind of a symbolic entrance and exit to the campus. I mean, it's not a physical gate on the edge of campus, but it is a gate or an archway within it. And I think you can assign certain interesting symbolic meanings to that. And another thing that the architects did, which I think was great, is, and again, this idea of being site-specific, and something that's not really appreciated too much, but they built this thing on an ellipse. And if you see this whole space, including where Becoming is, it's a big ellipse, and the ellipse is even carried through in gray pavers that traverse the red brick streets. And so the architects here were trying to tie the whole corner of the campus together, kind of this campus and that campus and that campus all together through this very subtle and beautifully geometrically prescribed ellipse. So this was celebrating the 100th anniversary of the campus, and at the time, Dr. McChesney, the president at the time, had been visiting a lot of campuses around the country, and he noticed that in most campus settings there was some sculpture, and he thought it would be good to have sculpture on campus. And he approached me with the idea of designing a piece that would speak to the Montevallo experience. And I was flattered, but I was scared to death. I mean, he was asking me to produce one of my pieces on my campus, where I'm a colleague of everyone, and speak to a grand ideal, which is the Montevallo experience. And so it was very troublesome design-wise for a lot of reasons, but I finally came up with the concept of Becoming. And when I started thinking about what teaching was, or what the Montevallo experience was, your first thought is it's about faculty and students, and it's about that interesting dynamic that happens where the willing professor is imparting knowledge on the willing and receiving student, and that's where that magic happened. But I realized that the Montevallo experience in all education is really much more than a faculty and a student. And so I wanted to design a piece where I was celebrating the whole of the institution. So it's not, this Becoming, which we'll talk about in a minute, is not just about faculty and students, but it represents a whole university. And that includes the maintenance people and the cafeteria workers and the custodial staff and the administration, and of course the faculty and the sports people. It's all of us being on the same team that allows us to interact with students and hopefully impart some knowledge on the students. So it's not singularly faculty. And so I think a big misconception about my sculpture is it's about the teaching experience one-on-one between faculty and student, but it's really about the whole university helping to guide the student through their career here. So that was an umbrella kind of concept for me to consider. I still had no idea what the final image was going to be. I knew it needed to be conservative. I can't put a big orange cube in the middle of this campus, you know. It needed to be something that was personal and something that was sensitive and hopefully something that was symbolic, but something that fit within the confines of this beautiful facility and campus. And so I came up with this sculpture, which is obviously figurative. It's two hands. You know, at that time I'd been making art for 40 years, and this is only the second figurative piece I've ever done in my life. As I mentioned earlier, when I came through school, we were not trained at all in figurative expression. And so, so this is kind of self-taught, you know, working with the figure. So when Dr. McChesney asked me to design a piece, as I mentioned earlier, I was real nervous about what I would do, and also I had free reign over what I produced, and I was given, you know, any site on campus could be the location for this sculpture. Now, of course, with artistic freedom and choice of location, you know, it was not just up to me. It was up to me to come up with the design and the location and all that. But I had to jump through a lot of hoops, go to a lot of meetings, get approvals from a lot of different constituencies. You know, obviously the administration, the alumni, the staff, the board of trustees. I had to make presentations to all these entities and make sure everybody was on board, because, you know, hopefully this sculpture is going to be a dominant visual element on this campus that I love so much. And I wanted it to be appropriate. So, as I mentioned earlier, I was really taken by the architect's wonderful design, I think wonderful design, of this Bowers colonnade and Centennial Arch and the ellipse that they created. And so it seems to me that the perfect site would be opposite this gateway, on that pad, on that part of the ellipse, kind of tying in various parts of the campus and hopefully making this whole area significant. So it's just not the archway and gate, it's not just the sculpture, but it's this really dynamic kind of intersection of all these roads surrounded by artistic expression, which I thought was really, really cool. So I came up with the concept, and I needed to figure out scale. Scale was important because it couldn't be too small, it couldn't be too big, it had to somehow fit the proportions in the surrounding area. So I measured the height of Maine, and it turns out that that is 64 feet right there. And I happened to measure the height of this gateway, and it happens to be 32 feet. So that's half of that. So then my sculpture became obvious mathematically that my sculpture needed to be 16 feet. So we go 64, 32, 16. And then when you're standing in it, and I don't expect anyone to get it, but when you're standing in it, it's comfortable because there's this kind of spiral from tall to medium down to low and then finally to you. You feel this spiral of space around you that makes it feel comfortable. If the hands were way too big or way too small, it would be probably imperceptible, but maybe not, awkward feeling kind of situation. So the scale became important. Obviously, as I said before, this is the second figurative sculpture I've ever done, and it's probably one of the most conservative sculptures that I've ever done. But it is embedded with what I think is a lot of rich symbolism specific to the Montevallo experience. And so in the front is this tall hand which represents a student. And I interviewed a lot of hands and arms for this. I really did. I wanted a hand that was long and sleek and confident looking with good proportions. And it's amazing how different our hands and arms all are. I also wanted to be androgynous. I didn't want it necessarily to be male or female, but actually this was modeled after a woman's hand. But the sex of the hand is just not important at all. I guess you could say, well, it's traditionally in the women's school, so why not? You could go there if you want to, but it wasn't important to me. So we have this tall hand coming out of this pedestal, and it is hopefully confident, and it's moving upward. You get a sense of upward motion out of it. And around the index finger of that hand are two keys. And the keys are a classical Greek symbol for the acquisition of knowledge. And as I started thinking about using the key as a symbol for knowledge, I started thinking about, to me, there's like all kinds of different kinds of knowledge, but basically there's stuff that you learn in the classroom, the taught stuff. And then there's the successful person has that taught stuff, but they also have other things that are not taught in a classroom, things like motivation and maturity and empathy and acceptance and responsibility and a lot of the non-taught things that young people, successful people, gain, these kinds of non-taught bits of education. So one key represented the academic side of that type of knowledge, and the other was the non-taught kind of knowledge that successful people obtained. And if you look at the keys, the bottom of the keys are actually the opposite of one another, almost like they're like puzzle parts, where you could take those two keys and you could fit them together and they would fit, making kind of one unit. And that suggests to me the necessity of these two kinds of education, two kinds of knowledge to work in harmony with one another. Now that was the overall concept of that. And it was pointed out to me actually 10 or 12 years after I made this piece that, well, yeah, but those two keys also make the symbols of UM. And if you, I really did not see that. And it's amazing how you can start to see things in your own work that you didn't see when you initiated it. So yeah, the two keys interlock, suggesting two kinds of knowledge. But if you want to look at it a certain way, one key is kind of an M and the other kind of a U. So we have that as well. Now, behind the aspiring, young, youthful, full of knowledge student is an older hand, and that older hand was actually modeled after my hand. And that hand represents the university, not the faculty, but the whole of the university. And I found an old hand, which happened to be my own, and I modeled that part of the sculpture after that. And if you notice, the pose of the hand is almost as if a parent would be taking a young toddler around. The pose is almost as if you taken the student, the universe took the student by the hand and guided them through their career here. But now that hand has dropped back, and the space between the student hand and the university hand represents the moment the student graduates from me. And it's a time where, when we think back on our education, whatever kind of education you had, education is probably a pretty profound part of who we all have become. And we can think fondly back on teachers that impacted us. We can think maybe negatively on teachers who didn't, but nonetheless, we can remember our educational experience. And the space then between the two hands represents the fact that, yeah, okay, you just graduated, even though you're leaving here, the university's always got your back. The university is going to be part of your experience moving forward. And so that's what that suggests. Now, just an interesting tidbit, as I've got arthritis and had it when I was making this pretty badly. And if you look at the back side of the sculpture that represents the university, the index finger knuckle is really expanded and swollen the way mine actually was when I built that thing. So we have the student hand armed with the keys. We have the university once supporting, kind of physically supporting the student, now dropping back after graduation. And if you look at the pedestal, the base, it's made out of limestone and bricks. And obviously limestone and bricks are all over this campus. So that's definitely a reference to the architecture of this place. But if you look more carefully at it, you'll notice that the elliptical shape of the limestone and brick base is made up of individual wedges, and all of these wedges converge directly underneath the student hand. And all of those wedges, to me, then, are symbolic of various aspects of a student's life. It's what makes us all unique and makes us different. I mean, one wedge might represent your family experience, another might represent your spiritual beliefs or your religion, another might be your physical abilities or whatever. And so all these wedges are symbolic of different parts that make up our whole. But if you notice, the largest wedge there is a wedge that's covered with bricks, and those bricks are actually street bricks that we cut down and applied to that base. And that wedge is where the university hand is mounted. And that again is suggesting that no matter what our experience is with education, probably for most of us, our education is one of the most important things that's ever happened to us. And so and specifically for the Montevallo experience, those red bricks under the university hand help drive that home. And so when I designed the pedestal, I made sure it was, I believe it's about 20 inches, which is a comfortable seating height. And so if I could provide a place to sit, I kind of automatically knew it would be a place for people to gather. And I was always very pleased anytime I come on campus and I find people sitting on it or reading on it or talking to each other or listening to music or whatever. So that was really an important feature for me. There's a plaque over there, a nice bronze plaque. And it tries to describe the sculpture, and it says that I did it with my students, made it with my students and all that. And but it also says some statement about the sculpture is about the interaction between the faculty and the student. And I have to say that that's wrong. As I mentioned a couple of times in this interview, it's about the student and the whole of the university. And if I could correct anything, it would be that statement on that bronze plaque. I think people need to realize that an institution is much more than any one of its component parts. Faculty are an important part, administration an important part, custodial staff an important part. And it's that teamwork that creates an environment where good teaching and good learning can take place. And that's what this sculpture is about. It's not about faculty, student alone. Now, one of the most fascinating parts of the process for me was to be able to build this thing on campus. And I will say that this is the biggest bronze project that I've ever constructed. Previous to this, I think I made something 2 feet by 2 feet or something like that in bronze. This is 16 feet, 2 big hands. It has more than 12,000 pounds of bronze in it. And it took 2.5 to 3 years to construct it. And I was really fortunate to have built a foundry here on campus where we could actually build the whole thing with student assistance and create this work. So my students, undergraduate students, had an extremely professional experience while building this piece of public art. And we did it over a period of several semesters. And each semester, in addition to my regular teaching load, I'd have a class in public art or in becoming or whatever we called it. And it was a class where that class during that semester would work on this piece. And like I said, it took almost 3 years to complete it, from 2001 to 2003. And it was all done here on campus. And I would say that for a small school like the University of Montevallo to have a foundry in its art department is very special, very unique. There's probably only, I'm thinking right now, the only foundry I know in the state is University of Alabama at this moment, and here at Montevallo. So that's a special feature that the art department has been able to support and put together here on our campus. Basically, how do you make a sculpture like this? Well, it's a very complicated process, and I would suggest if you have an interest in this that you would maybe just look up lost wax bronze casting, and you'd get maybe an overview about the basic process. But basically, I started out with full-scale models. So I took a mold of the student hand, actual size, 16 inches, a mold of my hand, and I made a casting of that and looked at those details very carefully. And then I scaled them up with proportional calipers and things like that. And basically I had to make this whole sculpture in clay first. So what you see there at one point was all clay. And that in itself was quite an accomplishment. And then once it's in clay, then you need to divide it up into component parts that could be cast. So I take molds of specific parts of the clay sculpture. For instance, each finger might be its own mold, and sections of the wrist and things like that. In other words, well, let me just say that the sculpture was divided up into 99 different pieces, and those 99 pieces were individually cast in bronze, and then they were all welded together and ground, and so they became a kind of a seamless sculpture. So physically and technically, that's quite a challenge, working with 99 parts that all have to fit together to create a whole. Now, before the parts were actually cast in bronze, let me back up just a little bit. The whole piece is made out of clay. Molds are taken of the clay sections. Then wax was put, a thin 1/4-inch layer of wax was put into each of those sections. And it's that wax that is in the lost wax process that's replaced by bronze. Now, while it's in the wax surface, in the wax stage, it can be manipulated. I can scratch on it, I can do this and that. And while I was making this thing, I realized, well, we have the whole inside of these two hollow bronze sculptures that are never going to be seen. So I invited anyone on campus who wanted to come and write their name on the back side of these pieces. So there's hundreds of names, you know. Somebody loves somebody, somebody thinks this faculty member is great, someone doesn't like them. You know, there's all kinds of physical statements inside that sculpture on the inside of those bronze castings. And then before we finished it up, we kind of made a time capsule out of it and put a whole photo album of the process, and I think my hard hat and my steel toe boots that were kind of worn out and safety glasses. And so we put those in the bottom of that sculpture as well. So at some point, if it's ever melted down to make canon, which is what happens to bronze sculpture, it did, you know, they'll find these interesting artifacts that only a few people know about. Now everybody knows about it because I just told you about it. But it was a great experience to work with students on a project that many people never get to explore or experience at all. And a lot of people in graduate schools in art don't ever experience this either. So an undergraduate student who had to have a real professional experience was pretty important, I think, as a faculty member for me, and I believe for the students who participated in it, you know. So I'm real pleased with that aspect of my being able to continue to teach through the making of this sculpture. So just down the hill here is the university's art department sculpture facility, and we have a foundry there that we cast all these individual parts, and we have a welder there that we welded all the parts together and finished them, ground them down, sandblasted the whole thing to make it a uniform surface, and then put a patina on it, and finally waxed it. And then, so the sculpture was just on the edge of campus in the sculpture facility. And then we hired a big crane and brought it in here on a weekend and installed the piece. And I've got some pictures that I'll share with you of the actual installation with this big crane lifting these hands above the ground. It's pretty exciting, actually. As I mentioned earlier, in my personal career, I've always enjoyed the big projects, and while I continue to make a lot of small pieces, I really enjoy making the big pieces that require more than myself, like I say, engineers or pushing me into an area that I haven't been before. Like Like I mentioned, this is the largest bronze casting I ever did, and I enjoy that. When I retired, I was worried that I would not have an opportunity to do any more big work. And I was very fortunate. Almost as soon as I retired, I got an opportunity to do this piece in Columbiana, Alabama, which is, interestingly enough, about the history of Columbiana. And it's about our agricultural history. And I found a real artifact on the site, which was a set of millstones. And it's about the industrial history of the community, which is Shelby Iron Works. And so I tried to join these two historic features of Columbiana, agriculture and industry, into one kind of sculpture which speaks to the fact that it's our past that gives rise to our current culture. And so that's what that sculpture is about. Part of my teaching of sculpture, and particularly in the metal work, has been to get my students interested in this concept of public art, where you make something specific for the community. And if you notice at Ebenezer Swamp, there's a big dragonfly, and there's a big frog, and there's a big giant crane, almost 16 feet tall, I think. And a few sheet metal sculptures that have been designed by my students. And it was an opportunity for them to design specifically for Ebenezer Swamp and to, again, produce work. For an undergraduate student to have work in a public place is really kind of rare. And so we try to give those opportunities as much as we could. So Ebenezer Swamp has some sculptures from students of mine. And also, if you notice around town now, there's several metal sculptures that were designed. They look like they're little kid drawings. There's some around the high school, there's some around the library. And this was a project I came up with by collaborating with the art teachers at Montevallo Elementary School, where I asked the art teacher to have their students do some drawings, and maybe drawings of what those kids saw themselves in the future, what they would like to be as they grew up or whatever. And these kids do these drawings. And you know how little kids do drawings. They're just so uninhibited, and they're not worried about mistakes, and they just draw with honesty and heart. And unfortunately, somewhere along the line, I don't know what grade, some art educator would be able to tell you this, but at some point, students get self-conscious and they start to draw like this, and they don't want anyone to see what they do, and they want it to look like somebody else's. But when little children draw, there's this amazing amount of creativity and freedom. So by collaborating with the art teacher at the elementary school, I was able to collect a lot of those drawings, and then I took my college students and we blew those drawings up as accurately as we could, and they learned how to cut steel and weld steel and paint steel, and also place them in the environment. And we had maybe 20 of these sculptures all surrounding the Montevallo Elementary School at one point. And then they did a big renovation, and they had to take all the sculptures down. And then eventually, those sculptures are now coming back on campus because of some interested people who want to support the arts and want to make Montevallo better and want to celebrate these kids' drawings and artistic talent. So now we're seeing these sculptures that were done maybe 10 or 15 years ago in my classes, sprinkled around town. So I'm enjoying seeing that as well. Now, in terms of my future, I don't have anything on deck right now, but I'm happy that I'm healthy enough and energetic enough and want to pursue another big piece. So we'll just see. Maybe we'll sit down in a year or so and see if I've done something additional, but on a big scale. But currently, most of my work is in the 5 to 6 foot range in my home studio, that kind of thing.